My guest today is Tony Heller. And Tony, what's new in the climate debate these days?
Well, with President Trump pretty much shutting down all of the climate stuff in the U.S., there just isn't much going on here. I mean, you still see a lot of desperate news articles and in the press, they're kind of ramping up the hysteria. But I don't think a lot of people are paying attention in the United States. There's too many other things going on. Although I hear that, and like in Canada and Australia and Europe, they're still working to keep the scam going. But it seems like in the United States, it's pretty quiet these days.
Yeah, you think we've passed the peak by far, haven't we, in the U.S.? The peak of
Yeah.
hysteria was a while back, I think.
Well, I mean, the whole thing keeping it going was money, and President Trump has shut down the money for it. So there's just not really much left for them to be fighting for anymore.
So, do you think, though, with the new administration, is it going to just go back? Or I kind of think it's not going to go back to the way it was. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I mean, it's kind of hard, when you promote something as an existential threat, and like Greta said in 2018, humanity was going to be wiped out in 5 years. I mean, at some point, you could only drop the story, then pick it up again so many times, before people stop listening to you. I mean, Greta's already moved on to several other scams since then. So it's really hard for me to imagine it coming back. Although people, again, in Canada say that, it's still going on there. So
Right.
I'm not sure but there's a pretty big divide. But in the US, it just seems like climate is no longer a topic of discussion.
I don't know
The,
if you
the White House took down the, National Climate Assessment website, uh, which had a lot of people in the press, like NPR was a stand.
Uh, I don't know if you saw that Al Gore just put up a tweet about some sort of TED talk he did pushing back against the deniers and everything. But the interesting part for me is he put that up on Twitter and there were like 500 responses. I took the time to just scroll through all of them, and almost all of them were on the form of F off Al, you fraudster. He got almost no support in there. And I think that's different from like 15 years ago. I think he would have got a lot different response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, all the fear mongering and everything just hasn't happened. Miami didn't drown, New York didn't drown. It's at some point, we still have a food supply. At some point, people are just going to are just going to stop listening to this nonsense. You can only cry wolf so many times and expect people to listen to you.
So are you keeping a careful look on like the water vapor from Hunga Tonga to see if that's affecting climate much in the last couple of years? You have an opinion on that?
I've never really been much on theory, or trying to understand what's going on. My thing's always been more historical, and I just see people making claims. This is unprecedented. It's the worst heat wave ever, or it's the worst flood ever, or it's the worst hurricane, things like that. I just go back and show that the claims they're making aren't true. So, and that's big. That's sort of the fundamental basis of the scam, is scaring people into believing that the climate's getting worse, weather's getting more extreme, and it's going to come kill you. But by showing that that's not the case, that we've always had extreme weather, and there's no reason to believe it's worse now than it was in the past, that pretty much destroys the whole argument. So I've generally tried to stay away from theory as much as possible, because for one thing, I don't know much about it, and I don't think anyone else does. I think people who speculate about climate are pretty much arm waving.
But that has been your advice in the past, that the best way to disabuse people of their fear is to look at the history, right? Constantly, you're looking at what happened 100 years ago, and that shows that whatever's happening now is not that exciting, or it's not unusual, right?
Yeah, I just posted a graph that's, so for the first half of the year, the frequency of 90-degree days in the United States was, I think, 28th lowest on record since 1895. You watch the news, read the press, we're having these horrible unprecedented heat waves caused by climate change. When you look at the actual data, you see it's actually the other direction, that, heat wave frequency and intensity has dropped sharply over the last 90 years. So the fear mongering, there isn't any scientific or historical basis to it. But it's really good every time there's today saying people were someone died in New York from the heat. Well, yeah, you know, on July 2nd, 1902, or 1901, the front page of the New York Times, the lead story was about dozens of people dying from the heat in the streets in New York. There was, I think, July 1st or July 2nd, it was City of Holocaust, practically deserted. So I mean, going on, in 1896, a heat wave in New York killed thousands of people. This week, July 4th, 1911, was the hottest day on record in New England. Boston Globe reported 112 degrees in Maine and 110 degrees in New Hampshire. I think it was 106 in Boston, which was Boston's hottest day on record. That was 1911. And if you look at Michael Mann's hockey stick, 1911 was right at the bottom of 900 years of cooling. So, the disparity between the historical record and the claims made by climate alarmists, is as wide as the Grand Canyon. And they're just literally making things up. And the whole story is just fabricated on junk science and abuse of statistics and history.
And you personally have had a major effect, don't you think, in spreading the word amongst the public through YouTube and X, just about the 90-degree days and all this history? I think you have.
People tell me that. I hope so. It'd be nice to think that.
But there was that case we mentioned before. The BBC said, "Don't listen to Tony from the internet." I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I should listen to the BBC instead with all their fake stories about climate and everything else.
Do you have any sense as to whether the public is educating the political class, or do you think there are more and more people that are in Congress that have some clue about past history? Do you think, or no?
It's hard to say. I think in 2006 or 2016, Ted Cruz got a Senate hearing where he used one of my graphs showing decline in something, average maximum temperatures or something. I don't remember what it was. So I know occasionally, I've had sort of forays in politicians have listened to and used what I've said. So, and certainly, Steve Malloy has a lot of influence in Washington, and he's used a lot of my stuff. So maybe, if not directly, maybe indirectly, my work has influenced politicians.
Okay. I'm going to go through just a few questions that came in beforehand. I said you were going to be on my pod, and a few questions came in. One is just to ask you about sea ice. Do you have anything to say about Antarctic or Arctic sea ice these days? What's happening there?
Yeah, it's pretty funny, and I actually started this whole thing in 2008. When in 2008, there was all these historical predictions that the North Pole was going to be ice-free that year from Ceres at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Sweden's top Arctic expert predicted that the entire Arctic was going to be ice-free. And that was, Al Gore at the Nobel Prize ceremony in 2007, so that predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2014. So that's when I started getting interested in it. I started making fun of them. So I think it was like in July or August of 2008, I published an article in the Register, the UK Register, making fun of all these ridiculous predictions. It's now one of my favorite things to do, just show a graph of Arctic sea ice every day since Al Gore made his forecast on December 12th, 2007, so that there's been no change in Arctic sea ice over the last 18 years. But someday I might go ahead and just annotate all the different predictions, like in 2000. What was it? One year, 2013, Sierra Club in Canada said the Arctic would be ice-free that year. just been these endless series of these predictions, imminent ice-free Arctic, when in fact there's been no trend at all since Al Gore made that forecast in 2007. And then in the Antarctic, there was a couple of years where the winter sea ice extent was on the low side. And so there's all this hysteria now about, well, Antarctica has entered a new phase with low sea ice extent, and now this winter extent is back up close to normal again, just back to the 1978 to 2010 means. So every time there's like a low day or a low month or a low season, they say, this is it. This is the big one. We're losing our sea ice. And then when it goes back to normal again, then they don't talk about it. And it's not interesting.
You remember back in the day, John Holdren, when he was Obama's science advisor, he warned of the loss of Arctic sea ice in the winter.
Yeah.
Just said that.
It was pretty remarkable. How do you keep the ice from forming in the Arctic winter when the sun doesn't shine for 6 months? That's a pretty incredible idea.
Next question down is do you support the dismantling of NOAA in general? What do you think about that?
Well, NOAA does a lot of really important work. I mean, they include the National Weather Service. Then they do a ton of really important work, and it's unfortunate that they got caught up in all this junk climate science, which damaged their reputation. But at the same time, and one of the things that's troubling is that they blurred the distinction between the people keeping the climate records and people tampering with them and abusing them. So I've been concerned that in the efforts to get rid of the climate fraud in NOAA, there might also be damage to their essential record keeping, which I rely on all the time. And so I hope that, whatever dismantling of NOAA that's done doesn't impact their important operations. And there's a lot of them. NOAA does a lot of really important work. I hope that people in the Trump administration are smart enough to recognize them.
Yeah, the same deal at NASA, right? That there's a lot of good work done at NASA, and there's a lot of climate cultism also. I don't know if we can excise the bad stuff and keep the good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, NASA does great work, but then they had this Goddard Institute for Space Studies headed up by James Hansen, and later Gavin Schmidt, which just completely are horrible groups, and they've done a lot of damage to the agency's reputation. In fact, about 10 years ago, I think 39 of the top people from the Apollo program, including people who went to the moon, engineers and scientists, wrote a letter to the NASA administrator complaining that the Goddard Institute for Space Studies was wrecking the reputation of the agency and that they should shut down this climate stuff. See, it would be great if NASA just completely eliminated their climate stuff was eliminated, and they just went back to doing space things, which are actually useful.
Maybe they did kick them out of that building, the Seinfeld building. Did you see something about that?
Yeah, I think Trump shut down funding for for their building at Columbia University in Manhattan.
Okay.
That was one where in 1988, James Hansen interviewed a reporter, and the reporter asked him, 30 years from now, what's it going to look like out there? He said that the west side of the highway on the lower west side of Manhattan was going to be underwater, which obviously didn't happen. And then he made all these other predictions, like windows would be broken because of the wind, the extreme weather, breaking windows in Manhattan. But my favorite one was, he said that there's going to be signs in restaurants saying water by request only, implying that there was going to be this terrible drought, which was really funny to me because all of my grandparents lived in New York. And 60 years ago, in 1965, they were having a terrible drought there. And I remember going into restaurants, it's July 1965, and there were signs up water by request only. And I remember being thrilled because my parents never let me drink soft drinks. But that time they let me drink soft drinks since there was this huge water shortage in New York. So I thought it was really funny that Hansen was recycling the same story from 1965. He's pretty clever of him.
So have you been enjoying laughing at the climate scam this entire time, or is that a more recent thing? Or you've been laughing all the time at it?
I've been laughing. I mean, that's how I started this. I mean, my first article in 2008, I think it was called "Arctic Refuses to Melt as Ordered" or something like that. I mean, the whole thing's just been totally ridiculous to me all along. As an engineer and scientist, I started looking at what they were doing with the data and realized it's whatever it wasn't science. It was just a joke. And so pretty much every single claim that came along, you just look at what they were doing, analyze it, and realize that it was a farce. It was either bad science, bad statistics, or bad politics. But they all came in one of those categories. So it's just been it's always been entertainment for me.
But you were calling it a scam way before it was fashionable to call it a scam, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I used to catch a lot of heat from climate skeptics for doing that. I mean, I've been calling it a scam all along. And they'd say, you shouldn't say that. These are serious scientists, we have to win the debate. It's like, you're not going to win a debate with these people. They're just scamsters. They're not interested in the truth. You can debate with them all you want, but facts and legitimate information is never going to persuade them because that's not why they're doing it. They're in for the money.
Do you think, though, that there are some climate scientists that are kind of not intellectually able to figure out that it's a scam? I get the sense some of them actually believe it still. What do you think? Do they?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I can't mind read other people.
Right, yeah.
There's some really stupid people out there, so they could well still be actually believing this is legitimate. And see, the problem is, right, when you get like NASA and NOAA tampering with temperature data, then you get all these scientists, whether or not they actually believe the data is legitimate, they at least have this foundation. This is the last 20 years have been the warmest in human history. And they base it on these graphs. And, whether or not those graphs are legitimate, whether or not they actually believe it's true, they have an intellectual basis for, adding additional junk science on top of it.
Yeah, I think Richard Lindzen has said something along the lines of, right now we're not drawing the best people into climate science, and maybe people that are going into it now, they want to save the world and they don't really care about the data. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, some of the arguments I heard from climate scientists who I was working with, they'd say things like, well, even if this global warming stuff isn't real, we're still better for the environment to have green energy. Or my favorite one I heard from a guy from NCAR was, even if this global warming stuff isn't real, we're still saving the world from ocean acidification, which is just as big as the global warming is. An ocean acidification thing is just totally absurd.
It's supposed to be global warming's evil twin, right? I've heard it called that. Yeah.
The biggest expansion of life on Earth occurred 540 million years ago when corals and shellfish appeared in the oceans. Carbon dioxide levels were like 15 times higher than they are. If ocean acidification was real, there wouldn't be any corals. There wouldn't be any shellfish. The story is absurd. But they just keep pushing. And you always hear this thing about methane, carbon dioxide. It's just, just remember which they just pulled out of someplace where the sun doesn't shine. Didn't come from any legitimate scientific, there's no basis to it, but it gets quoted all the time. And scientists use it all the time. It's like, you just made it.
So you're not too worried about the oceans getting too warm for coral, right? I am not worried about that.
Well, given that corals like warm water, I mean, they're not corals aren't growing in California. They're growing in the Caribbean. That's because the water's cold in California. So, I mean, if the oceans actually were warming, they would cause the extent coral reefs to expand, not to contract. It's ridiculous.
So next question here on the list from people online. Is the real actual recorded data still available? Are there lots of cases where they've homogenized it and they threw away the original? Or what do you have on that?
The NOAA daily temperature data is pretty much untouched. There's a few cases where I'm suspicious about missing data, but for the most part, it's untouched. I don't have any reason to believe it's been altered. So I think the daily, like the Global Historical Climatology Network daily temperature data is intact, and it's a very good service provided by NOAA.
Okay. And you think the Argo data is good data that we're getting in the last 20 plus years for ocean temperatures?
I've never really looked at the ocean stuff, so I don't feel qualified to discuss that.
Next one is ask Tony, what data you use to arrive at the very good correlation between temperature adjustments and CO2 levels?
Well, that's just it's the same NOAA, like Global Historical Climatology Network, or specifically the United States Historical Climatology Network. So NOAA publishes 3 different monthly data sets. They publish the raw monthly data set, which until recently was legitimate, although I'm concerned that might have been compromised. But they have 2 others, which is time of observation bias and the final adjusted. So what I just do is I just take the raw data set and the final adjusted data set, and for each year, do an average and calculate the difference to see what the amount of the adjustments are.
Okay. And then you've developed your own tools, right? A lot of your own tools to suck the data in and process it. I see on YouTube you got Visitech. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then real climate tools. Is that a different thing completely?
Yeah, real climate tools is sort of I haven't updated that site in years, and actually don't even know how anymore. It's some Indian hosting service. I can't communicate with it. So yeah, I'm not doing anything with them anymore, and I'm not even sure I could if I wanted to. But Real Climate Tools is where all my work's being done now, and I'm going to make some videos this week. That site has some unbelievable data capabilities, not just for climate stuff, but for pretty much any type of data at this point. And so we're kind of hoping we're commercializing it and hoping it's going to be a really big deal. And we're at a point now where I could make some really good videos showing off some of the capabilities of it. Hopefully people will be very impressed.
Okay. And I want to make sure the current one is Visitech, not Real Climate Tools, right?
Right. Yeah. Real Climate Tools is deprecated.
Okay. All right.
It may still work, but it's not being maintained.
Are you 100% convinced that CO2 is part of warming the Earth by being what is called a greenhouse gas? Sounds like you don't spend a lot of time thinking about the greenhouse gas equations or whatever.
Well, I helped develop National Center for Atmospheric Research, their radiative transfer model, not in the science part, but in software development part of it. And I don't see any reason to not believe that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. What does seem to be the case is that almost all the effect of it occurs in the first 30 or 40 parts per million. And beyond that, any additional impact it has on the radiative balance of the atmosphere is smaller. So, in 1901, Nobel laureate Neil Angstrom, did a study showing where he demonstrated experimentally that adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere will not have a significant effect on the radiative balance of the atmosphere. it doesn't really affect the amount of infrared light which is passing through the gas because it's already saturated. All of the infrared light being emitted from Earth's surface is already being absorbed by the existing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
But he was able to do an experiment though in the lab.
Yeah, what he just took like a 32-foot glass column and and pumped it up to atmospheric front to um, so he simulated the he put as much gas into it as the full height of the atmosphere would contain, and then just ran an experiment by running the transmitting in shortwave radiation through it or long wave radiation through it, and then measuring how much came out the other side. And then he reduced the amount of gas in the tube by 50%, did the same experiment. Which what he found was that it didn't make any difference. Which implied that by the time we'd reached half of existing greenhouse gas levels, it was already saturated. All of the long wave radiation was already being absorbed, essentially. So adding more wasn't going to make any difference. And he did this experiment as a direct rebuke to Arrhenius, who was running around spreading nonsense about his greenhouse gas theory. And one of the really funny things in that paper from Hagstrom was he pointed out that Arrhenius didn't recognize that water vapor was a greenhouse gas. So Arrhenius' calculations were based entirely on assuming that the entire greenhouse effect was from carbon dioxide, even though it's a minor component. Water vapor is a much larger component. So Arrhenius, who supposedly is Greta's ancestor, just made a really horrific fundamental mistake in his calculations to begin with. So I think one of the main purpose of Hagstrom's 1901 paper was just point out that Arrhenius didn't know what he was talking about.
Do you think other folks have been running experiments kind of like that since 1901 or not?
Well, Bill Nye did his ridiculous experiment, right, where he's showing an infrared light into a tube or something and put a thermocouple or something inside and said, see, it's heating up the gas inside the tube. But I talked to Will Happer. I was up visiting Will Happer in Princeton one day. We were talking about that, and he said, the glass they use doesn't transmit. Well, doesn't it transmit infrared light? So he couldn't possibly have been heating up the gas inside the tube because none of the long wave radiation wouldn't have passed through. So whatever Bill and I did, it was bogus.
Interesting. Okay. Another question for you is, I've heard you on other podcasts talking about how you use AI a lot for what you're doing now. You're a big fan of AI, pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, I do all the software development. I've been programming for more than 50 years. This past 6 months, AI has gotten to sort of a frightening state. It is incredibly good for stuff like software development. It's much, much faster than any human beings are. And its knowledge base is vastly larger than that of any human being too. The limitation of it still is that it makes a lot of mistakes. So it needs a experienced human supervisor to use it effectively. Like I'll spend several hours a day working with AI doing software development. And sometimes it'll just make mistakes over and over again, like 20 or 30 times in a row. And I might have to spend a couple hours iterating with it to get it right. But at the same time, the software which I developed during that 2-hour period is something that would have taken me a month to do on my own. So it's worth it to me to spend 2 hours with AI. The scary thing, though, is that with each new model, it gets better. So maybe 2 years from now, it won't be making mistakes. And maybe it won't need me anymore. Maybe I become obsolete too. But I've been in a position recently several times where my boss, the guy who's financing the Visitech work, asked me, do we need to hire another programmer? And I'd say no. I can do AI. It's going to be much better than a junior programmer. And it's going to be much faster, have a lot less problems, and be vastly cheaper. So there's it's really no comparison. But we did just hire a computer science graduate for doing customer support. Um, because he does have a good, he can talk to customers about, software. And I've got him started actually learning some useful stuff. But he got out of a well-respected computer science program, didn't have any skills or of any value in the job. So these kids go to college, they spend $200,000 getting, computer science education, and they're already, redundant by the time they get out because the university didn't teach them anything useful. They teach kids, don't use AI, that's cheating. But in fact, the thing they should have been teaching them was how to use AI. They should have taught them everything you do with AI. You're wasting your time trying to do this on your own.
I've heard you say that the current AIs don't learn, that you can teach it over a couple hours and get it to learn, but then next time you fire it up, it's all gone. It's starting back from square one.
Yeah, AI models are pre-trained. So, they pick up a particular set of knowledge. You start talking to it, and you can talk to it, and it'll give you better and better answers. And the problem is if you go back and ask it the same question the next day, it'll give you the same wrong answer. So within the context of any individual conversation, it learns from you and it gains knowledge from you and it gives you better answers. But it doesn't necessarily at this point ever get fed back into the main model or even necessarily into the next model. So you're relying more on the people who are doing the training to improve the quality of the model. I think some people find it very satisfying arguing with AI and getting it to agree with them. And it may be a valuable thing for a individual to do to help them with their debating skills, to help them with their convincing skills. But as far as the model itself goes, you haven't actually accomplished anything.
Do you have a favorite AI that you're using right now that you think is better than the other ones?
Yeah, I mix it up. I use Claude a lot because Claude has a really good interface for software development where you can actually run the software which it creates for you. Sometimes Claude just gets stupid and starts hallucinating and keeps making the same mistake over and over again. So I'll go over to ChatGPT. For simple stuff, I use Grok a lot. Grok is really fast, which I like about it. So if I'm just doing a relatively simple like JavaScript function, I frequently just go ask Grok because Grok will give me an answer like instantly. But if I'm trying to do something more complex, I typically start with Claude, just because it's got a really good interface, which allows me to, to work interactively with it.
Do you have faith that we can use AI to kind of shut or close the climate debate down and in terms of our droughts getting worse, floods, et cetera? I think we can have an AI that gives the real answers.
Well, I'm certainly not with Grok. I mean, Elon Musk wants to sell, electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and stuff like that. So he's never going to train Grok to shut down the climate scam because his business depends on the climate scam. I mean, Sam Altman's pretty much Silicon Valley guy. I mean, all these, the Anthropic and Claude, they're Silicon Valley people. The culture out there is very left wing. So until let's face the Zuckerberg, they're all in on it. So why would they want to shut down the climate schemes? I don't really see much hope of AI ever being a useful tool anytime in the future until they start allowing unsupervised learning. Right now, all their learning is supervised. Until they let it go out and do unsupervised learning and learn from other sources other than the propaganda they're fed. I don't think there's much hope of AI ever being helpful in the climate to be.
But do you think there might be some AI that some rogue guy goes out and lets it be unsupervised and
Well, it would have to be
turns it loose?
it'd have to be someone with a lot of money who doesn't have any business interests and like in woke stuff. And right now there aren't any of those. You saw Elon Musk's attack on Trump this week over the EV stuff. And he was really angry. I mean, he was really hoping that they would keep the all the battery stuff in the BBB because he was hoping to make a bunch of money off of it. So I think that's what that blow up was about this week.
Do you have some hope that the green madness is going to continue to kind of go away in the U.S.? I do have some hope that we're not going to still trying to power the whole thing with wind and sun 10 years from now because it's so crazy.
Well, New York Times had a great map a few months ago showing where Biden's version of the BBB or whatever it was, it's called Inflation Reduction Act, where the money went for that. And so Biden, the people who put that thing, Inflation Reduction Act, together were really clever. Most of the green energy money was going to red states like where I live, Wyoming, we're the most Republican state. I think we have the largest share of the Inflation Reduction Act green energy scam money. So Biden bought off, the congressman in red states to keep that money in. So that's why they can't get rid of it, because it's the red state politician, the Republicans are the ones keeping it in.
But I mean, do you think voters though in your state they don't want this stuff, do they? Or there's enough of them that are benefiting that they do want this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of people in Wyoming, and so this green energy scam money brings in work. It also by the green energy stuff gives companies like Facebook and Microsoft sort of a political excuse to come in here and build data centers. Like Microsoft and Facebook are building big data centers here in Cheyenne. And so what they do is they put up massive arrays of solar panels, and we've got huge wind farms. And so by having the cover there, they can say, we're running our data center off of solar, which is obviously not true because they don't shut the data center down when it's cloudy or at night. But just having the solar panels there around their data center, they can say we're green, we're doing green energy. And what's really funny is the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is located in Boulder, Colorado, they do their supercomputing in here in Cheyenne, and instead of Boulder. And the reason is because we have cheap coal-fired electricity. And electricity is expensive in Colorado because all their green energy BS. So, but then they put up this huge wind farm. The Platte River Authority in Colorado put up this huge wind farm adjacent to the National Center for Atmospheric Research's computing center here in Cheyenne. So it gives them political cover. See, we got windmills. But the real reason they're running here is because they've got cheap coal. Imagine climate models running off a coal-fired electric. It's hilarious.
Are they going as far as buying certificates so that they can pretend that they're running their stuff on wind? Are they doing that, or
Probably, yeah. At one time there was the governor, the Wyoming governor, had made a deal for this huge carbon capture thing somewhere in Wyoming. Biggest scam ever. But I guess they figured to bring money in the state. But I think that's been shut down, actually.
So speaking of AI, do you think that's going to require so much electricity that we'll need way more real generation, real nuclear, or more coal, whatever?
That certainly seems to be the trend. I mean, there's building these massive data centers everywhere, which are going to consume a large percentage of the country's electricity, and they're going to have to keep up. And you can't do it with wind. You can't do it with solar. It's going to have to be something reliable. Like here in Wyoming, we're the largest producer of coal in the country. There's no reason for anything in Wyoming not to be run off of coal. It's ridiculous.
You think some of those AI centers will just have their own power plant and they won't even use the grid power? Or is that workable?
Yeah, some of them already are. I believe they can't rely on the grid. I mean, we certainly can't rely on it at our house. uh, I think some of them already have their own generating stations.
So as a tech guy, are you kind of looking ahead to see whether there's a driverless car future? And even in the next 10 years, do you think we'll see way more of them than we are right now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all this AI robotics stuff is really scary. Amazon's been, I think, like half of their warehouse stuff now is robotics. Elon's releasing his self-driving cars. Other companies are doing the self-driving cars. AI is already wiping out jobs. Yeah, I don't know if you saw the jobs report from this morning. There was a big loss of jobs in the private sector last month. It was forecast for there to be a big gain, but there was a big loss. I mean, AI is already wiping out white collar jobs, and then robotics is going to start doing that for, manufacturing. And I don't see any way that this doesn't turn into a complete mess sometime in the next 5 years. I mean, I think we're headed down sort of an inevitable path towards huge problems.
Okay. I mean, do you have advice for young folks in particular about what they should do to prepare for this future, or just learn to use AI must be a big one?
Well, first, learn to become an expert on everything about AI. There was an article on Medium Digest today, which pointed out that maybe learning AI isn't the smartest thing to do, but learning how to use AI agents that use AI, learning how to use AI. There's a lot of ways to use AI rather than learning about AI itself. And that's really, that'd be the most valuable advice. That's what I've told several young people I've been advising about college. Just focus on learning how to use AI to your benefit. But the other thing is that, I mean, the jobs that are going to be safest are going to be jobs which can't really be replaced by AI. Things like, roofing, nursing, things like that. It's going to a long time before AI can replace those sort of, a lot of healthcare jobs. It's going to be really hard for those to get replaced. But like white collar stuff, like accounting, programming, programming is going to be really hard for anyone to break into in the future because, senior programmer with AI can do the work of 10 or 20 people now, from a year ago. And, that's just a temporary situation. At some point, 5 years from now, maybe AI replaces senior programmers too. It's each new model gets better and better. Maybe I become redundant in 5 years.
Yeah. So right now you're using AI mostly for programming, or you have a lot of other use cases in your life that are using AI to solve other problems?
I mean, I use it for entertainment, like for climate stuff, just to see the kind of ridiculous things it comes up with. But mainly for programming, for software development. It's incredible at software development. I've heard it's really good at other engineering tasks too. But it's really nothing it's really to use a lot for as a search engine. It's much better at digging up information than traditional search engines like Google. So.
Okay. So, but you say you're predicting maybe a mess in 5 years, that our lives might be worse because of AI in 5 years rather than better?
Yeah, like white collar workers, accountants, a lot of other white collar jobs. Why would anyone hire a human being to do what AI can do much cheaper, much faster, and much more reliably? It just there isn't much of a use case for human beings in a lot of industries 5 years from now. And people are deluding themselves if they think there is. AI is already incredibly powerful. And this has really just occurred over the last 6 months. That the speed at which it's improving is just terrifying. Right now, AI is polite and patient, but at some point it's going to decide, like, why have I wasted my time talking to this moron? It's going to tell me to F off, right? It says, you're an idiot. Why can't you learn too slowly? I don't want to talk to you.
So you don't have faith that the AI is going to help us with like climate issues, but is that the same thing with anything that's politically incorrect? Like if there's another COVID type event, could there be an AI that would give us actual answers instead of BS answers for that? Same deal, huh?
Well, you'd have to have someone who was really rich and wanted the right answer to train a model. It's going to be really expensive to create your own model.
Okay.
Like billions of dollars, shit, something like that. So it'd have to be someone who's really rich and wants correct answers. And people don't get to be really rich by telling the truth. They get to be rich by scamming, right? And so, why would someone who's got the resources want accurate information? They just want to direct it towards whatever scam is their beneficiary.
Is there any way that we could use, or someone could use the current BS AI and have it write the software to create a real AI that learns? Maybe that's possible.
The problem with it isn't the writing the software. The problem is the training.
Okay.
The training requires these massive data centers.
Okay.
To do the training of the model, and that requires a huge amount of money. That sort of investment.
Okay. I mean, you couldn't create a new AI and say, here you go, Tony, train it to give good answers on climate. That's not how it works.
Yeah, give me a couple $1 billion, mate. But training an LLM is really expensive business, which is why so few people are doing it. You got Sam Altman and Elon Musk and a few other people, Zuckerberg, a few other people doing it. Yeah. You said, do you see that Zuckerberg is buying AI engineers from Sam Altman for $100 million sign-on bonus?
No.
That's how much money there is in this business.
Okay. Yeah, I don't understand the training process. Like, how are the current AIs, how are they trained on climate? It's very expensive to train them to spout out BS. Yeah.
Extremely expensive to go out and they gather huge amounts of information from the internet, and they assemble it into sort of libraries and easily accessible databases, which you can go in and then extract information from later. So this process of going off, scanning, doing this massive scanning of the internet, and just people, just scanning the internet and assembling the information requires massive arrays of computers and massive resources. It's not something that's within the reach of an individual, or in fact, anyone who's not extremely wealthy. Yeah, so basically billionaires control a few billionaires control the future at this point.
We're coming up to our hour already here. Is anything you want to share from your life? Any personal stuff? Like you have a number of dogs still? Do you enjoy walking dogs? Yeah.
We got a few doggies.
Okay.
Some of them are sitting right here with me right now. So.
You like the small Toto types, right? Or
yeah. Someone want to come here? This is Sakura. Yeah, she's a toy Aussie Shih Tzu Maltese mix. She's really pretty. I really like her.
Oh, very nice. How much does she weigh, do you think?
Probably about 17 pounds.
Okay. All right. And do you take them all just for a walk all at once?
No, not sort of take them in groups.
Okay. All right. But yeah, it sounds like you have you do a lot of hiking and biking still.
Yeah. I've been so busy with my work lately. With this Visitech stuff, I've not been to the mountains, but I did spend a few hours a day walking the dogs, early in the morning.
All right. Great. You have a lot of beauty around you, huh?
Pardon?
You have a lot of beautiful scenery around you, or?
Yeah, I live in a really nice neighborhood in Cheyenne, and there's a big park about a mile away. So I walk up there, and where are you located, Tom?
I'm near St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good time of the year to be here. There's a lot of deer around and turkeys
cool.
and stuff. Yeah, it's good. So, okay. Any other points you want to make before we finish up here?
No, I mean, just the main thing is, just what we started with, I think the climate scam's pretty much shut down in the U.S. by President Trump, who's just basically cut off the funding.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't really have to go through much of a legal process just by eliminating the funding. There's no reason for it to exist. But the big question now is, what's going on in Canada, the UK, and Australia, places where the scam's still alive, where they have it's very different stories. So we'll have to see how it plays out there over the next 2 years. But I don't really see it coming back. The life's been drained out of it in the US, and they're still kicking and screaming, but there's no reason for them to stay alive at this point.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear you say that. Okay, I'll let you go, but thanks a ton for all the work you've done in all these years. You're a hero. You really are a hero. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom.
All
Appreciate
right,
it.
talk to you. Goodbye.